Okay, hey everyone, welcome to Unique Ways with Thomas Gerard, an audio podcast. We've got a really distinguished guest today. He is a professor in design in the School of Interactive Arts and Technology at Fraser University here in Canada, where he founded the Everyday Design Studio. In addition, he is a professor and chair of design for more than human-centered worlds in the Future Everyday Cluster in Industrial Design at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. He is the author of the book Things We Could Design for More Than Human-Centered Worlds by MIT Press in 2021. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ron Wakkary. Welcome, Ron.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Thomas. I'm happy to be here.
My pleasure. You ready for 20 questions?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, here we go. Number one, tell me a little bit more about yourself. What do you do?
Yeah, so I think you covered a lot of that in the intro, but in brief, I'm a design researcher and design educator. I think as a design researcher, I'm certainly interested in design, but I think I have a slightly different approach in that I look at the way that I think the things that we make in the world, and of course through designing, it kind of discloses things about the world. To me, I was always more curious about what design can tell us about the world than what design can tell us about design. Of course, it's important. I think if you're interested in, the impact of the field of design, and I think the future of that impact, and of course, as an educator concerned about designers, future designers, and design students, but really my interest is in this: what can I know about the world through the things I make? And then that sort of led. I think you mentioned my book that came out last year on things we could design. And so part of this is also unpacking some of the assumptions that we have in design. For example, the idea of human-centeredness in design, and just to speculate and think about what might be an alternative to that. But I think also something that we're pretty aware is not speculation, but pretty urgent, whether that's climate change or some of the inequities that design creates, or maybe even just questioning why are we always so focused on what's good for humans, a kind of human exceptionalism, and perhaps a kind of principled design has become an obsession that is perhaps a little bit more harmful than I think we would like or even are willing to accept. And so anyway, I think that that's really what I try to do, is kind of use design and as a way to kind of ask these questions, speculate, and the ones that I really believe, because I do think we do. Obviously there's much more that we need to understand about the very complexities of the lives that we lead and the lives that we create. And design is a big part of that. And I think also if you look at I think, again, if I return to climate change, I mean, I'm really considering what have we, the world, for example, we live in a multi-species world, but how much of that is really a part of design? So those might be the kind of questions I ask. And I kind of have a history of doing that through the work I've done. It's always been about asking these kind of philosophical questions, but then really getting down to the kind of material reality and the particulars of trying to ask those questions through designing something.
That's great. Just a note for our audience, if you end up liking this episode, be sure to check out Dr. Philippe Pasquier's episode about artificial intelligence. He works at SIAT as well. Number two, what's a key piece of knowledge that makes you different?
Yeah, and actually, before I answer that, yeah, shout out to Philippe. I think he's a great colleague, and he does share something that I share, which is a kind of dual, sort of a background in art, and in his case, a kind of AI and generative music, but also a pursuit of kind of science and research, and I think that for me, I think that's characteristic of a real focus on the particular. I mentioned that about designing. When you design something, you're so focused on details, and you're always wrestling in part with the kind of very particular connections that things have together. They're very frustrating, whether it's whether it's working through particulars of laying out fonts, or whether it's actually trying to get two things to connect together. So it's a very particular kind of focus and a craft. At the same time, really have a kind of conceptual focus, a kind of, as I said, asking philosophical questions. So I think if there's something unique, it's going to tying together that particular with the conceptual, those bigger questions, and that relation to I started out in life wanting to be a painter, and so in painting, and I think that sense of particular, which is very much, dealing with the materials of paint, literally how to get paint to adhere to canvas and how to mix the colors together and not end up with something that's just completely brown. And so you really, you can spend hours just focusing on that. But then, of course, you're trying to do something larger with what you're making. You're trying to ask sort of conceptual, sometimes really difficult questions and sometimes non-intuitive questions. And bringing that to the world of academic research and bringing that to the world of design, where I think design has a lot of particulars to it, a lot of material reality of the, and then there's also the sort of pragmatics, the professionalism of design, the industry of design. But then I think there's also on a conceptual level, the kind of real importance and the impact that design has, the ethical questions it runs into, the philosophical questions, who we're actually designing for, and so on. So I think it's maintaining that kind of contradiction. I think is something I like to think that I bring to whatever I'm doing.
That's awesome. One of the reasons I'm so excited to have you on is I reviewed your 2021 book with the BC Review, formerly the Ormsby Review, and found it to be really a really special piece. Number 3, why this of all things? Why do you do what you do?
Yeah, and of course, before I answer that question, thanks for the review. I thought you really actually did capture some of what I just talked about. I think some of the kind of trying to do some of the kind of analytical work, but then some of the creative, I guess, kind of forays that I tried to do, so creative aspects of the work that's in the book. So I appreciated your review quite a bit. The question, why this? I have no idea. I mean, I think you obviously, a bit of a cliche, but very much true. I mean, life's a journey in a way, and you start off on a certain path. And like I said, I wanted to be a painter at first, and then that shifted to was not as interested in doing the individual sort of I-centered work of being an artist. I was much more interested in collective and collaborative work. And then really interested in as I said before, the contradictions that you don't have in art, but you have in design between the practical reality, the material reality of now, but then the possibility that this has really endless ways of thinking about the impact and thinking about the interventions that design does. And I think you just kind of you kind of arrive at these things. But another level, though, I would say that sometimes you don't get caught up, or I didn't get too caught up in the kind of permanence of categories, what it meant to be an artist, what it meant to be a designer, what does it mean to be a researcher, what does it mean to be an academic, that there's a kind of impermanence to those titles or categories or notions, because there's a lot of threads that connect them together. There's being critical, being creative, being curious, asking challenging assumptions, thinking past where we are now, like more than human-centered design. How do we get past our own rootedness and human-centeredness? This kind of exploration, and then thinking of others, which we do in different pursuits, and how might what I do, or what how might that benefit others? And those are threads that cut across. So in some ways, it doesn't really matter what you end up doing. I think I think the commonalities are some of the pursuits, and you find that when you run into somebody who's doing something very different than you, but actually shares a whole lot of beliefs and a lot of commitments, and you're actually pursuing the same thing in very different ways.
It's super exciting for me to hear you talk about art and design kind of in parallel in this way. As a person who's been educated in art and design, I always found those. I found a lot of kind of people perceive those as two very different things that shouldn't kind of connect in this way.
Yeah, I think so. I think if you're going to be like, I think you're self-aware and you're self-critical. And I think, when we get into a particular discipline, we are critical about the assumptions within that discipline, but that also should mean that we're not so bound to it, and not in a destructive way, but in a very constructive way. And so in that sense, that you're not caught up within the bounds of these different categories.
Nice. Number 4, what does your future look like?
Yeah, first of all, I guess my future, I would say, with respect to many others, is quite privileged. I think, I think that what I have to look forward to is much better than many other people in the world. I think you just have to kind of acknowledge that, but also in the sense that, if I think about, I think actually Philippe said something really interesting. I did listen briefly to his podcast, and I think the future is something you got to be committed to, because that's when we're going to spend the rest of our lives. And so I'd also to think about how we are all going to spend the rest of our lives. It's not an individual thing, and I think privileged in the sense that I've had the ability to live my life in kind of material ways that haven't really had to take in the full account of what we're a real urgency now we have around climate change. That for many other people is much more their future, and it's our present, which I think is a good way to think about the future. I think sometimes that we get too caught up in it's almost as if the future is a kind of repository for fantasies and all kinds of other things that we think are going to happen, and really much of the challenges we can deal with and be much more accountable for are actually in the present. And so I would, and I think I have, I'll take that on as something that I think with respect to climate change, something I need to be accountable for in the present. But I think the other thing, just to be more specific about thinking about the book, that and the research that I do and design research that I do, and trying to think, I guess in some ways, I was trying to think, well, what else can design be, or might design be, or what, and in part because it's such a young discipline or young endeavor, despite the fact that we've been designing things for millennia, since the very beginning of being human. But nevertheless, I think that question about in the book was, when I wrote this, was trying to get ahead of where my own research was, and in the sense that I may want to unpack human centeredness, but of course I've been so trained and so grounded in ideas of human centeredness and design, and ideas of humanism philosophically. So how do I undo that? And in part, writing is a kind of foray into the future. Writing is a way of, but it's a good foray to the future. In fact, that you write things down that have a certain permanence. You commit to them, because they're there literally in black and white on a piece of paper. And so I find myself in the kind of future now, trying to live to the commitments that I've written about what and how I might be designing or should be designing, and to think in this more than human way, to think relationally, to think about beyond designing for human values and human good, and to think about what it means to cohabit a world that is more than human, and is relational and really quite expansive. And it opens up all kinds of questions. And one of the, for example, I do think, a question I have is the way in which we think about design methods. And I think actually part of the limits of our design methods is the fact that we are very anthropocentric about the way in which we approach design. And that kind of material embodied way is how do you change that? Not that you can actually change the fact that you're human, but how do you find to work at the limits of what it is to be anthropocentric? So with materials, that might be a different way of actually relating to them, or things for example, we're doing work right now on designing in a multi-species context. We've been doing a lot of work with designing in a context focusing on bees, and the multiple species of bees. And then the question really becomes about how might one relate to and interact and understand, and partly because we have no choice but to speak for bees, and how does that affect the way in which we design? Another kind of immediate feature for me in designing and design research is I talk about in the book this idea that we need to what I call constituency, that is who and what we consider. So again, if we think about this in participatory design, we often want to bring in multiple stakeholders, human stakeholders, into our project and discuss the values and the goals of what we're going to design. But if we start to think about this in a more than human context, how then do we invite those that are not human, and how do we speak for them, and then how do we determine the values? What might we design and what is good? And I talk about this as a constituency, a need to kind of create or collect this gathering. This is what Latour calls a sort of parliament of things, where you have this kind of negotiation. And it's a collective structure. I think that a collective structure for design, and I think we have to rethink the collective structures that we have for designing. We tend to think of that as consultancies or corporations in the UX, kind of industry. And in order to tackle, I think, some of the issues that I'm talking about, the more than human issues, climate change issues, et cetera, I think we have to rethink the way we collectively organize before we even think about designing, that supports the way we design. So kind of come back to some first principles is what do we value in design? And then how do we create the structures by which we can actually act on those values?
Nice, I like that a lot. Just a quick note for our audience, if you're liking this episode, be sure to check out our next one. It'll be with Dr. Johal, who works in a very different department, but also at SFU. Number 5, let's talk about location. How does the notion of place play into what you do?
Yeah, that's a cool question. I mean, I think it's really important. I mean, I can talk about it. I mean, for me, I think that, um, I mean, actually, I think also this idea, going back specifically thinking about designing, is that we tend to, I think more and more the trend has been to kind of um, formalize design universally, as if there's one form of practice of design you might have, say, here in Vancouver, another you might have, say, in South Africa, and one you might have in Australia, when in fact, when you really look historically at design, it's always been place-based, it's location-based, it's about the material resources that you have, it's about the cultures that you form. But we can expand, I mean, I think expand on that even, beyond design when you think about, say, for example, indigenous epistemologies that locate ways of knowing in place, in landscape. And of course, there is a much more relational, kind of more than human understanding about how you aren't not just part of an ecology, but you very much live with sort of other living beings, and it's particulars of that combination of living beings that form place, and it's from there that you act. And I think that I think that that's really important with respect to design, to break down this kind of idea that there's a universal design and to think about designing in more situated ways, and to also then be accountable more locally, and then to work with issues and stakeholders, as I mentioned, but also I think the more than human ecologies that are of place, and I think in that's really important, and I see that on a real practical level. So for example, as you mentioned, I also I met Simon Fraser here in Vancouver in Surrey. And I'm also at Eindhoven University of Technology in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And on a real cultural level, you can see the difference. I mean, you could, especially I think in the Netherlands, when it's part of the reason why I'm there, where design I think is so much the culture of designing, the understanding of designing, the values of designing are so much about place and landscape. I mean the Netherlands is the majority of land being below sea level, the necessity to live with water, but also done through creating, sometimes in various forms of resistance and opposition, creating dikes and creating irrigation systems. But this kind of this real understanding that to actually even literally occupy the space that you're standing on is indebted to a degree of engineering or design, that you really wouldn't be able to be there without that. And that kind of works its way through the whole understanding of the role in design and the place of design, the values of design in a deep kind of cultural sense. And I think it really shifts the way in which it's thought about. It's thought about more broadly than as a matter of industry, for example. And so, and I think that's something that's really hard to realize, to think about. It's such a different landscape and place here in BC and in Vancouver. It's very even hard to think about land as something that we don't just can assume, or there's a different sets of issues around land, all the territorial, the unceded territories and the different histories and colonial histories that have kind of worked their way through and into our consciousness about how we think about land. And that also has affected design. I mean, I can discuss decolonization of design here in Vancouver, where it's much an issue that has to be sort of introduced and supported and discussed more fully. In the Netherlands, it's again, different context. So I think these are all grounded in kind of place. And I think that's really important. But I think also, I think that it's sort of shifting and grounding the work we do as designers, not so much thinking about this in global economy terms, but thinking about this in geography and place and situatedness, and then thinking about ecologies not as some broad abstract term, but literally the kind of, what's the particular, there's a particular urban ecology if you live in Vancouver that involves humidity, that involves different species of, non-human species because of the climate and the culture. And you can ground these terms in more specifically, and then you can deal with the complexity of place, but that also really deals with the reality of the place.
That's a very full answer.
Yeah, and let me know when I'm getting way too abstract for you.
No, it's super good. And more connections to the Netherlands. I mean, starting in episode 3, we're already going there in many ways. Number 6, if you had to start from scratch, what advice would you give your former younger self?
What a horrible question. I don't know. I mean, horrible in the sense that I think, I read this question. I said, what am I going to say to Thomas with this question? And I thought, well, I think that and again, horrible in the sense of how do you avoid, every time I try to come up with an answer to this question, I thought, well, how do I avoid a cliche? And I really could not. I think if there's something I would tell my former, so the word I came out with, well, I think there's a couple of words I came out with. One was, I think having confidence in what you believe in. And it's kind of an easy, I mean, it's not easy to understand that when you're younger, you lack confidence because you lack experience. And there's a greater sense of the unknown and what happens when you fail. And so it's hard to be really confident. Or, you want, of course, the flip side is you don't want to be too confident because then you're just arrogant and cocky without really the basis for having that kind of sense of certainty. But I do think if I go back, I think that there's and I think about this a lot when working with students and thinking about how they, and particularly PhD students or master's students, and how do you position yourself? How do you navigate through the sets of concerns and the questions that you have? What do you want out of this research? And not as like an ego thing, but it's really about orientating yourself, finding a compass, and navigating. And part of that comes down to kind of having a kind of confidence in sets of intrinsic beliefs. I mean, not to be blind about your own beliefs and to blindly apply them, but what are the tools that you need to have a degree of confidence that allows you to act from intrinsic kind of motivations, less so explicit? And again, when you're younger, it's so much about the world around you and trying to get, I guess, some level of confirmation from the world around you. But again, if I had that extra bit, I would say, well, screw them. Just do what stick to what you believe in a sense. But I do think that is something you develop that really grounds you, it allows you to ask questions, I think, in more interesting ways, and then to act in more interesting ways, and actually ways that I think are more beneficial. So I don't know, I guess that's what it would be. I think to have the confidence and to kind of cultivate that kind of intrinsic understanding of why you believe in what you believe in and why you think you should act, with, of course, the self-awareness to correct when you really should correct.
I like this idea of the compass and kind of being able to visualize and navigate, having that idea in your head and letting that kind of drive you forward. Number 7, what's your day in the life like?
Yeah, again, I think it's pretty privileged. I don't have the, in some ways, yeah, I have a lot fewer concerns than I think a lot of other people have in their daily lives, and I feel pretty privileged and lucky about what I do. But get down to I mean, again, it's also pretty boring. I think if you get down to the nuts and bolts, you get up in the morning. I actually, because of my affiliations in Europe, I end up doing a lot of calls in the morning, quite early in the morning. It's their end of the day in the Netherlands. That's at least when I'm in Vancouver. And actually, when I think about it, what happens in in a given day depends on where. It goes back to your place question. It really depends on where I am at any moment. But yeah, do my workout, meditate, yoga, whatever it might be. And then try to get on to the particulars of the day. And I think what I like about the work I do is those particulars have, I can spend a day just talking to a lot of people. I can spend a day kind of just working through a design problem, so to speak, about how we're trying to make something, or working through the crafting aspect of that. I can come to the studio, engage with everyone here, but also work on some real particular kind of problems, but also at the same time have some wild conversations, So yeah, I guess that's how I characterize my day.
I can relate to that. I mean, I've mentioned it before on the cast, but being in 3 different geographic locations at once, maybe teaching a typography class in Vancouver and then being in a conference in Europe and talking to a school in India, all at the same time. You can kind of have 3 copies of yourself, which is really nice, actually. Number 8, lifelong learning is a popular topic these days. How do you stay up to date?
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of what you mentioned, I mean, and I feel pretty lucky this way. I mean, I feel lucky as a, as a professor that, I mean, I have first of all, I'm just, surrounded by, some of the young and kind of like smartest people I know. And, that's, mostly the students. So, whether they're undergrads or grads or PhDs. And, these are the people I talk to every day, all the time. And it's like an extension of it's the collective mind, having like hundreds of other curious minds that you get to check in with on a daily basis.
Mhm.
And of course, but that's part of, I mean, I learned about how much more, not just, I mean, everyone talks about, oh, you should listen. And I think listening is a good thing to do. You're very appreciative of what other people's perspective, but also there's a real enlightened self-interest in listening as you learn a lot. And trying to understand what are the concerns and questions and experiences that others have, and that really keeps, particularly again, and I think about this in the professional world of trying to do the work I do, and so that's really helpful, and then I think the other thing that goes with that is as you mentioned earlier, is travel. I mean, I am lucky to be able to travel. I mean, I often concerned about the kind of carbon footprint that creates and try to find ways to offset that. But at the same time, this over the years just have created this. I mean, for me, I think we have a really wonderful network. I mean, of people literally throughout the world that I'm in pretty good contact with. And I think but I think there's one thing to be in contact with people online, which is a regular feature of life, of daily life now. But to go to another place to kind of embody that and sets of concerns and to sort of infer what's interesting. Maybe it's not told explicitly, or to kind of get a more of a gestalt of when you are on a trip and you're talking to different people, different place, and you can see what the sets of concerns are. And I like that urgency. I mean, I tried to bring some of that. I mean, honestly, it was so helpful for me when writing the book. I really felt the questions I had, the urgency I had about those questions about design and what's the value of design and what should we be thinking about, and arriving at this idea of cohabiting and arriving at the idea that maybe we need to think past what we've done in design to get to issues of climate change and inequities and try to work through ethics in a different sense. That was from, people at students and people and again, the range of people that I come into contact with, whether they're and from whatever state they are, stage they are in their career. But I think related to design, there's some really urgent questions, but also interesting ideas and pathways and frameworks. I don't want to say solutions necessarily, but approaches to kind of tackling this. So I think that traveling is really helpful in that respect. That context shift, and in some sense, you kind of start to feed off of that context shift because those constant context shifts, because they keep you questioning and they keep you thinking. They give you a really productive degree of uncertainty. It's kind of the thrill of kind of having some level of knowing, but a lot of not knowing, and so that kind of keeps you going. And then reading and looking at work and reading and always seeking out design. I'll always go look at art and then trying to read stuff that's not my professional read. I also have the reading list I have to do, what I call the mercenary reading that I have to do for work. But then always being sure that there's something in my bag or on my shelf that has nothing to do with work.
Nice. Just about halfway here. Number 9, what tools do you use? Are you entirely digital? Do you have an analog approach at all?
Yeah. So I don't know, what tools do I use in like daily life, or tools I do to make our work, or just in general?
Sorry, yeah, tools for work, I guess would be a common kind of way to respond to this.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I guess, I think about like proximity. I think about the tools that I have around me, the tools I bring when I travel. And I have to admit they're getting less and less. And I have, and I mean, really to be real specific, I mean, I think I've come down to, if I really had to, all I really need is my phone, and I need Apple Notes. And I'm pretty good with that. As long as I can also draw on notes, which you can sometimes do, or you can always scan stuff.
Mm.
So in that way, I think that's, I think that kind of course, I use a little bit more than that, but it's been, I have to say, I mean, I think that on the kind of really specific day-to-day work level, devices have gotten far more distributed. Um, Tools have become simpler for me, and I think it's so I think that's, I think it's always a question of being able to, like, I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't be able to survive without Dropbox because
Mm,
I don't need to carry anything. I can always just access something,
mm,
access data. Um, in terms of work, like the design research we do, and this is something I've always wanted to bring into digital technology and digital design from the very beginning, was a different sense of materials, and not different sense of materials for the sake of materials, just because of the different, I don't know, ways of, what they offer you in terms of engaging the world, or just slightly framing things very differently. And to be specific, if I look at the work, we have made things with wood, with ceramics, doing a lot of work now in textiles. Um, and so there are these different kind of craft. They're always digital objects in the sense there's some kind of embedded electronics. Electronics are always a constant. So I guess in that sense, we're always working with whether it's programmed, but a lot of electronic hardware, circuit making, and so on. But of course, it's also very distributed. I mean, I know one person can do it, and so I work with a team not just here in Vancouver, but it's also a network of people, a lot in Netherlands, but also around, and so a lot of this kind of like tools out for me. They also kind of get them secondhand kind of experiences, but I always, try to work with, even though I'm not experienced enough to do a lot of the weaving. I've certainly worked on the looms to try to get an understanding of what that is.
mm,
Um, so yeah, there's really a range. And one of the things I like in our work, and I really want to do this, and I just think I always think about. I mean, I got into, specifically my main, I guess, flag where I would plant where my flag has been planted in terms of design is in human computer interaction and interaction design. So it's very much computational and digital,
mm,
and I've always approached it in the sense of design, and I've always seen design as so broad in terms of the materials and the things you can bring to the making, which I always thought was very narrow in the sense of digital technologies, was so focused on the electronics and the software. And sort of expanding that is something I really kind of tried to pursue. And that has meant an expansion of tools that we use, but also then expansion of skills, which then comes through as expansion of people that kind of embody those skills or have that craft ability. And I guess I sometimes come to it in different levels of proximity.
I can relate. I have a foot in interaction as well. And, I think I first started trying to do that in a very kind of digital way or non-physical way until the making started entering that in the maker culture. And then there was
Hmm.
kind of a necessity for the tangible things. We're at halfway here. Number 10, how do you deal with the work-life balance?
I don't know. I'm probably the worst person at that in the sense that, I think it's so episodic, things change. But I also think that, um, I think there's something to, I think the kind of, it goes back to this question of permanence. Like, I mean, how much, I mean, I think it's actually quite porous, that boundary between whatever, I guess, your work, your professional life, and your personal life or your family life. And of course, there's dangers. You don't want it to be to totally, and that's a very point of your question. You don't want them to become one and the same.
Mm,
But but I do think you kind of, I think it's interesting in the way that, I mean, I think there's a balance. I think balance in general is something, but I think that balance in general comes down to what, a lot of these things could fall away very quickly, and you like, work could literally fall away quite quickly from my life. And what's important, of course, is family. What's important, of course, is who you care for. And so in that sense, that's always a return. I think if anything, work-life balance always has to come back to what are you going to return to that you actually really care for, and not necessarily what you care about, but who you have to care for, and what you value. And in part, that's also your own health. So I think that drives a lot of that question. Um, but I think the one thing, I mean, it's, again, maybe it's a, and again, it could can, I think it's definitely a privileged position, but I think I think trying to always locate that kind of passion, always trying to locate that degree. I mean, it's an overused word, but that degree of fun, you know.
Mhm.
And I think when you lose sight of those things, then that's probably better indicator than the fact that maybe you didn't make, you know, yoga class or something, and that your life balance, your work life balance is all shot to hell. And I don't necessarily think that way.
Mhm. 11, if you weren't doing what you're doing now, what would you be doing?
No idea. Honestly, I have no idea. I have this. I actually was talking to someone recently, and it came up. I think we were doing something, and I said I had this fantasy that if I wasn't doing what I was doing, I'd be a sign painter. Don't ask me why I said sign painter. Although I think what it is just that I think it is an escape fantasy. It's like where you nothing else in the world, but you're just concerned about maybe, you know, the curvature of the S in in painting that letter, that word that you're doing. And I think it's a kind of thing I can relate to in the sense that my concerns with the particulars and details and making things work. And it's a comfort thing. If I had to really, but if I, and I was thinking about this, and I think it's episode, it changes too. I mean, there's so little that depends on when you ask the question. But one thing I would say though, that I'm starting to think about now, and I mentioned earlier, because we've been focusing on trying to think about designing in multi-species world. And
Mhm.
as I mentioned, we've been doing this work now on bees, and it's been incredible work. And we've been doing a lot of work with people involved working with bees, whether they're ecologists or they're hive keepers or they're biologists or they're concerned about pollination gardens, et cetera. And and earlier in high school, I hated biology. Now I have a a whole thing where, wow, maybe I could really get into that, you know? I think it is that kind of like door opening for me, for others who very much inhabited that world of biology. It's not obviously, but anyway, maybe that's a more straightforward way to answer your question.
It's a good one. 12, what would you not like to do career-wise?
No idea. I think it's just about like I can't. I mean, I don't want to put down somebody else's work.
Mm.
I would say, hey, well, I wouldn't want to be X, and that's what I do all day. I mean, there's certain things I can't do. How about that? And there's certain things that I would not thrive in, and there's certain things that I think where that would. I mean, I think there's something about you do the work. Yes, you do it for yourself, but you also do it for your what you feel you can kind of offer to others. And I think a work in which I felt like it was so self-contained. I mentioned being a sign painter, so I don't know, that does sound pretty self-contained, although someone could enjoy the signs you paint, I have no idea. Um, yeah, I think that would be it. Something where you feel like you kind of don't have those points of contact, where you can't be kind of, in some sense, doing offerings. Not that you're totally selfless, because you're not, but to be offering up things for other people.
I mentioned this in a podcast before, but in my early teens, I worked in an upholstery factory, sweeping up upholstery pieces, which can be kind of interesting, thinking
Yeah.
the materials and stuff like that now, but I wouldn't want to do that again.
Yeah, I almost I used to live in New York, and at one time we were going to rent this loft, and it was a pillow factory, and they did down pillows. And it was in the floors, you could literally see the little spikes from I don't know, I guess it would be the stems of coming off of the feathers
Mm,
stuck in the floor. It
mm.
was fascinating because it was just like decades of doing this, and it's just that. So yeah, I can imagine sweeping that up or having to take that off the floor would be kind of a pain.
13, what's your favorite word, quote, or sentence?
I think that I don't know if I have an enduring one. I can tell actually there's one I think I thought about for this because and actually it's just it's topical. No, actually, I mean just of course I mean I'm a big fan of Salman Rushdie and of course just the what happened recently in the tragedy. I think there's kind of this kind of attack on imagination, this attack on authorship, just what happened, and then the physical attack of him. But this was something I was listening to a podcast. So I think I'll use this, and it actually was a podcast I was listening to of him before that. And I was actually really fascinated because it's some work that I'm really interested in, the idea of speculation, and speculation as a kind of viable way of doing research.
Mhm.
And he was talking about this idea of fabulation and nonfiction, fabulation and truth. And he talks about the quote he says is how reality is established through make believe. And there I think, and I think it's really interesting because he's talking. She was actually specifically talking about a trend in literature, this kind of auto fiction trend, which is this idea that fiction comes out of, it's this combination of autobiographies and fiction. And so one grounds their fiction in their autobiographical life. And what he argued, I mean, it actually does touch on parts of what he's saying, but what he was lamenting was the loss of fabulism, as he calls it. So that the ability to kind of utilize imagination as a tool for understanding the world or reality. And I can relate to that because I think I make odd things, like I make a ceramic bowl that tilts to understand how we relate to technology. And so in some sense, I didn't really think about this till in the context of this sentence, it makes sense. It is kind of a fabulistic kind of object. You wouldn't make this normally. I call it counterfactual, but you could see it as almost being, a fabulism. But yet it's one that has some insight or disclosing properties about what a real world might be, i.e. how we relate to technologies in our home or how we relate to technologies over time. And I think that kind of, he also talks about it in political terms. He talked about how if he sees it for those non-European, non-Western writers that often use fables as resistance. He talks about as a Colson White that he wrote about the Underground Railroad, but talked about Colson Whitehead, but as if the Underground Railroad, of course, the Underground Railroad, where for during the slave era in the U.S. and escaping slavery, but wrote about it literally as an underground railroad. So this idea of using imagination and fabulism as a form of resistance. And I think it is an ongoing way of kind of trying to figure things out in the world. And I think design often too much is about trying to it's maybe I think he wasn't quite being fair to autofiction, but nevertheless it's kind of like trying to be the autofiction of the world, is trying to get people to ease of use, or or this is going to be something that's going to be good for you, or it's going to be aesthetic in the sense that there's not enough friction, there's not enough resistance. And I think that there's something that we can open this, this space up. And it actually reminds me of another quote. Actually, this was Alan Lightman, and he was talking. He's a physicist and also a fiction writer at MIT, and he was actually this quote actually I think comes from Richard Feynman, another physicist, and he was talking about imagination in physics and the role of imagination in physics. And if you think about where theoretical physics has gone, or you think about the thought experiments of Einstein or other physicists, this real role of speculation and imagination. But Feynman's quote was that the role of imagination in physics is imagination in a straitjacket, meaning that one can speculate about theoretical possibilities, but one, in physics at any rate, that must accept in some sense the past discoveries or traditions, unless one's really making a paradigmatic break. But so, for example, one can imagine a different form of gravity, but one that would have to make some allowance or acceptance of the ideas of theory of relativity, for example. And I think this is interesting. I like this in terms of the research they do about thinking about and design, where it can be speculative, but there's always the friction of the material world in some sense of putting it into the world. It's so different from art. I mean, art is put in the world, but on a kind of symbolic level. And of course, a lot of people might argue differently about that. But design is not necessarily put into the world in a symbolic level, but on a material level. And to me, I think sometimes having that imagination or having that fabulistic or having that speculative approach to kind of have as a form of resistance against that material world, but also a way of actually engaging it and discovering some kind of reality. And so that's why I really like that Salman Rushdie quote.
When I did my undergrad in design, I had a friend tell me that, if you're to ask me a question, by the time I finish answering the question, you'll have forgotten what question it was in the first place. Number 14, what's your least favorite word, quote, or sentence?
I don't know. I don't have one. I think it's unfair to words, but I think in the sense of words and sentences, I mean, I gave you, what did I give you? 1, 2, 3, 4 words because make believe is hyphenated. And then I gave you about like 1,000 other words to kind of explain it. So there's so much interpretation in words. So I don't think there's a word or a quote I don't like. Or if I did, there's a sentence that you don't like. It's the underlying belief behind that sentence. So if there's something that I don't like, I get upset about, or I think are these when people speak as if they're self-evident truths. And so sometimes I think, you like, for example, you can counter that in design. If I'm going to make an argument around design, and people might say, well, how does that what does that contribute to the practice of design? How does that make me a better designer? How does that improve the professional field of design? Nothing wrong with that question, unless it's presented as a self-evident truth that that's what design research should be about. And because then there really is the space for discussion is so much smaller. The space of possibility is so much smaller. And I think that's where I get kind of like, where I think it's like, again, some people that want to rule, utilitarianism or pragmatism or kind of efficiencies or productivity, economics, for example, or, you get this in science, you get this in physics, the validation. And so I think when someone really pronounces this kind of self-evident truth that this is what it has to be, then I hate that. There's nothing to discuss anymore.
I feel like some of what we're talking about here is problem solving versus opportunity finding, and how designers kind of, bridge those two. Number 15, if you had to pick one word to describe yourself, what would you choose?
Yeah, it wouldn't be problem solver. That's hyphenated, so that's one word. I don't know. That's a hard question. Can I pass?
You can pass.
All right, pass.
So we're approaching the final stretch here. Number 16, what keeps you up at night?
I'm a pretty good sleeper. I will say that. I think I just try to exhaust myself during the day. So it's a kind of physical thing, but I think you're really getting anxieties, so what anxieties do you have? And everyone has their own particular kind of anxieties. And I think mine is kind of rooted in, I think, as I mentioned earlier, some of the kind of like personality trait or contradiction I have to be very focused on the particular, to get really down into some really particular, very, very specific, it could even be, no matter how trivial, I'll dive right in, but in the same time, have a kind of like, see a kind of conceptual significance to it. And I guess that opens you up to the question of, well, really, how have you have you gone too far? Like, is that really relevant or meaningful to anybody? And of course, why it creates anxiety. I mean, of course, we all have that question: am I relevant, or is this relevant? But where the anxiety comes from is the degree of passion and commitment you put to that thing, which may not be very meaningful to others or meaningful in the larger scheme of things, which, I guess that's just kind of anxiety you live with. I mean, it's a kind of absurdity that you kind of keep going. Ultimately, your questions are really, I mean, how much, if I think about the time I might deliberate over what I'm going to eat for lunch, and it's kind of an absurd amount of time spent on something that's really quite irrelevant. But, so it's something that doesn't go away. So I think the anxiety part is something that it keeps you up at night, but I think the good news is you eventually fall asleep.
Nice. 17, what's a dream you're chasing?
I saw this question. I just think like, okay, so I'm not, I don't know that I chase dreams. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I just don't think that way. I think about kind of goals. I do think that I think it's aspiration, and aspiration, I think, is of course something that you don't have and you aspire to, but I think also recognize the kind of humility of falling short, and living with that contradiction, and I think that's fine, and I'm okay with that. And I would say, I mean, if anything, I just try to. I mean, I'd like to try to be generous, and I know I fall short of that, but I think generous also goes intellectually, generous in terms of the ideas, generosity in terms of what you're willing to entertain. Not that you should just be entertaining everything, but I think that kind of willingness to kind of kind of go for it and follow others, and see where that leads without kind of knowing the answers or even the proper degree of risk that might be involved. And of course that, that has its limitations. But I think acting that way is something, yeah, I would like to try to find ways to have that, maintain that degree of generosity.
18, what inspires you?
I guess that's the same thing. Other people who have that. I think I think it's some things I've talked about. I think some of the people, so I think when you see someone who has a kind of internal compass, I think that kind of intrinsic motivation. I also kind of, but then I think also really, I think those who kind of challenge the kind of inequities and have a kind of, I mean, sometimes it can go to, you can go too far with a firm belief in what's right and wrong. But I do think that I think that there's always something about kind of commitments and action. People who have commitments and then act on those commitments. It's something I find pretty inspiring. And then I think also, just like, as I mentioned earlier, just the people I encounter, the students, the other, my colleagues, other people doing work similar to me, and just inspired by the kind of questions and kind of answers that they come up with that just never would have occurred to me.
19, any advice you'd like to share?
I don't know. I think I've thrown out a lot of free advice. I feel that. So I think I'll stop now on my head.
Okay, 20, here's the good one. How can our listeners keep tabs on you? Where are your links?
Yeah, so I think Twitter is a good one. So at Ron Wakkary. I think that we are on the web. It's eds for Everyday Design Studio .siat for School Interactive Arts and Technology. So that's SIAT.sfu.ca. And I think those are the best ways.
Okay, I'm going to pull that up in a couple of minutes here. Okay, well, thank you so much, Ron. So much depth in what you're saying, which is, I imagine, reflective of SIAT, and I think that's a good thing. But hearing about how you're spending your time with students every day and how that kind of impacts your thinking and the things you talk about, I think is really great for all of us. And I think we can see the generosity in that. Yeah, thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation, Thomas. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.